Hello, everybody. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel, where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War from 1937 all the way up to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it. I'm joined yet again by my co-host, Gareth. How are you?
Hey Greg, wonderful to be back here and looking forward to another exciting episode that we have for the audience today.
Definitely. And for once, it's actually about the Pacific War. It's been a while. We've been kind of, yeah.
True. It's been a lot of North Africa, but hey, we are back in the Pacific War and going to be covering a very important naval engagement.
One that actually I think a lot of people aren't so aware of because it doesn't get as much attention. But before we jump into that, for once, I want to just, give a shout out to my Patreon at the beginning of the episode instead of at the end, as we usually keep doing. For those who, want to help me more, you can go over to www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to an exclusive Patreon podcast. I think there's more than 20 episodes by this point. You also get access to all the content I make and voting rights for what we'll tackle next as far as subjects are concerned. And most of the time, if you are willing to comment on any of the polls, I'll probably just take whatever you want and do it next week. There is an episode in the works based off of that. I can't remember what the guy had asked, but it had something to do with logistics. I'm going to be tackling that next. And for those who are curious, this month, the exclusive Patreon podcast episode is actually an alternate history episode on what if Japan attacked the Soviet Union in 1941.
Well, I mean that is quite a what if, but there's just very little strategic sense just given the infrastructure and terrain. So let's just leave it that because it's not, we are in a completely different realm of the world
True.
today.
So for those who haven't seen the title of this episode, it's going to be the Battle of Savo Island. And I was thinking I leave it up to my co-host to try and, build the context of the situation to, explain to the audience why is there a Battle of Savo Island and what's going on in the Pacific War up to this point.
Yeah. And Craig, first I want to just allude to the point that you said, it's a fairly important naval engagement, but that's not well known because even for me, when I first started reading about the Pacific War and everything, first obviously that came up from naval engagements was obviously like, Midway, then because of a book I had, Coral Sea,
Of course.
then obviously Pearl Harbor, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. But, Savo Island, I actually only discovered it from like I think some YouTube video like a couple of years back. So
Mhm.
until then it was like, oh,
Was
I
it
never knew
operations
it
room?
existed. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
of
was
course.
theirs.
Yeah, no, they do an excellent job. Especially other
Oh,
naval battle episodes are great.
oh yeah. I know I do see a lot of the videos. So actually I just finished a super long cut of the Leyte Gulf. That's where we were discussing about
Oh
that
my
the
God.
other
Yeah,
day.
it's insane the job that they did. And honestly, I've been talking with a personal friend of mine. His name's Ian, because he's a huge fanatic about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And he, for the longest time, he wants to do a multiple series podcast to cover like hour by hour the actions. I even told him like I don't even know if an audience can handle that in a podcast form because it's so long.
But it's definitely going to be a multiple podcast for Leyte
Yeah.
Gulf, just given how much is going on all the different prongs, build up everything. So, that would be but that definitely be interesting because, the Japanese did nearly pull off an Uno reverse
Yeah, no,
almost.
it's the last time where the Japanese could have quote unquote turned the tides. I mean, how much
Hmm.
so? But I mean, if you think about it, if they hit the troops, the transports, that it would have been a catastrophe. The amount of loss of life would have been insane for the Americans. It would,
Yeah,
yeah.
and see, I wouldn't say it would be like a situation that it's irreversible because the US had an industrial might that could easily recuperate the machinery, but
Yes.
the loss of men that would have definitely hurt morale.
Well, you actually
And
have to
then
think of it this way. It's not that the Americans wouldn't just continue and like build up, but if the Japanese managed to do that, they might have tried something at the peace negotiation. Like the Japanese would have had a
they could
poker
have
hand.
had, yeah, that is true. It's quite an interesting what if, but Taffy 3, I think,
Yeah.
uh that was an insane stand considering what they went up against. But anyways, I digress.
Yeah.
We have to go back in time about 2 years.
Yep. Big
So,
time.
like I said, this is one of the most underappreciated battles and probably doesn't get that thing because it was a major loss for the United States and allied navies,
Yes, it was.
right? So, just a quick context for the audience, the Battle of Savo Island happened just at the start of the Guadalcanal campaign. And in a nighttime action, Japanese Admiral Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, led a force of about 8 ships, one destroyer and 7 cruisers, and engaged the screening force that was supposed to protect the 1st Marine Division. And yeah, they like threw a mix up of both command personalities of the commanders and just the superior Japanese nighttime naval engagement skill, which would be a theme for at least the next 15-16 months, that the US surface forces would not want to engage them at night
Mm-hmm.
if they did not have a choice. The Japanese pulled off a major defeat on the US. you know 4 heavy cruisers sunk and 3 other
Oh,
warships
oh.
damaged.
I was gonna say let's leave the
No, but
casualties out for now.
No, but it's just, it should be given its due. And now what we should talk about is, how do we get here? Why is there a naval presence at Guadalcanal anyways, right? Because, that's what we need to set. So anyways, so when we start off with the Guadalcanal campaign, right? Uh, what happened is it starts a couple of months after the Battle of Midway. So we know in the battle, the Japanese main naval attack force, their main offensive power, has taken a big beating with the loss of their carriers at the battle. Even though the US has lost 2 in the build up to and during the battle, it's still a bigger blow for Japan, especially considering the crew quality, because that is, I think, the first mobile division, as it was called, and that had the best aviation personnel in the world at that time.
Yeah, the Kido Butais,
Right.
they're best
Kido
pilots
Butai.
who have been in battle for 6 months without rest. They lose a significant amount of the air crews on the aircraft carriers as well as the pilots. And the Japanese, they never fundamentally brought back their veteran pilots to train the new pilots, at least not in bulk like the Americans or other allied nations would do. And basically, it's a crippling blow. Their pilots
Yeah,
henceforth are going to be lackluster. Well, lackluster,
yeah.
less
The
effective.
quality is also going down, and because keep in mind, for naval aviation at this moment, the Japanese still have the technological edge in terms of aircraft,
Yep,
because I think it was not till I think the Hellcat arrived that uh the Zero fighter was bettered. Otherwise, I think for
yep,
now I would even give it like the Zero fighter is the most prime and best fighter of this entire campaign at
definitely.
this moment. So okay, we have Midway. The Japanese thrust has been blunted, and Admiral Yamamoto, who had that big idea of destroying the Pacific Navy of the United States, well, now he cannot do it anytime soon. So now the problem is the US is still gearing up for war, right? Even though it's been in the war for 6 months, 7 months now. But the problem is, one, the US and Britain have already agreed on the Europe first strategy.
Yes,
So any resources, whether it was going to, Douglas MacArthur's forces in Australia or Admiral Nimitz's command based in Hawaii and the Central Pacific at this point in time, they are first of all fighting an uphill resource battle, because by the terms kind of forced upon the British, who right now I would call the most senior of the two partners. Uh,
definitely.
it's like they want most of the supplies and everything going to North Africa and supplying Russia and Britain itself. And it still takes time to ramp up, even though the US had already started doing it. Like FDR got all the guys from the industry to start the ramp up, even like months before the war. It takes time. That's why I say, if FDR had never even done these steps, the US would not even be ready to mount any sort of offensive action, if you ask me, till maybe the start of 1943.
Yeah, pretty much.
If like they were pretty much a completely peace, non-intervention economy. Because if you look at World War One, right, they declared war in April of 1917,
Yeah.
but it's not till like June of the next year you start actually seeing a lot of significant number of American troops arriving into the theater. So, okay, so that is the situation right now. So the Allies have limited resources in the region, right? But they have one good thing I will say that goes for them. They have, at least from the Navy, Admiral King is the commander in chief of the Navy. What I really like about the guy is, despite like, him being someone like probably the most hated Allied commander
Yeah,
apart from Montgomery,
definitely. Yeah.
um, he was an aggressive guy, like, and he does not want idle assets, which is actually at this stage of the war a really good thing because he doesn't want like a destroyer flotilla sitting idle in like the Atlantic or whatever for 2 months. He's like, yeah, let's redeploy to the Pacific. And that actually makes sense. I'm pretty sure the British did not appreciate that, but
They
he
did
did
not.
fulfill his obligations to this. So now there were only three real routes that the Allies could take. One, in the build up to Midway, the Japanese had invaded the Aleutian Islands. So that is like, the set of islands between like, what if you were to see it on the map today between Alaska and Russia, I guess, right?
Yep.
I think that's where and it would come somewhat be like the northern flank and heading down south when you go west into Japan. All right. Now, this is always intended to be a diversionary force, even though for some reason, which I never understand, is what a naval force Japan gave for supporting that action,
Oh
which
yeah.
tied down a lot of assets, which could have been used better elsewhere where the real thrusts came. And the Americans also knew, okay, they have the presence, they've covered, they've taken a few islands, but it's not a big threat to us. We don't need to rapidly build up or combat here. So, there's no pressure or requirement to actually start the campaign here anytime soon. Unfortunately, even though after Midway, the Pacific Fleet and the could not take on the Imperial Japanese Navy present there, at least not anytime soon. It is still too powerful, right? With all of its air bases, all of the surface forces that it had, and there were more carriers also being built in Japan. Let's also not forget that. So with the limited strength right now, because you're having your battleships being rebuilt at Pearl Harbor while the new ones are coming in, the new carriers are coming in, but they take time. It'll be at least a year till they start coming in number. So you can't go here. But since the Japanese have already invaded New Guinea and are driving towards Port Moresby, this was felt like it could be the best way forward, right? This was maybe the broadly this area is where the Allies can first knuckle down, start gaining experience in combating the Japanese on the surface, on land, in the jungles, and then they can start building up from there. So so that's where we have the broad direction of the theater. Now here comes the contention point. We have two big egos on who needs to lead the premise. So initially, it was, I think, Operation Tulsa proposed by Douglas MacArthur and his Southwest Command. Please correct me if I got the command
That's
area
true.
wrong.
Yeah.
And he wanted support from the Navy. And this was basically all the build up to his drive to go back to the Philippines. And he wanted in the first Marine Division, which was I think at that time was the best amphibious trained division in the United States military. And anyways, it was discarded by the chiefs of staff because it was just like, timelines did not work. And the problem is, in all the armies, you really have this inter-service rivalry. Maybe in the Allies, it was never as much as what we would see in Japan and
Well,
the
yeah,
Nazi Germany.
that's a huge spectrum. That's kind of the most extreme to kind of rough. I'd say MacArthur, he really does put a lot of heat into the mix.
Yeah, I mean, and also unnecessary. I'll call that out. It was not needed. but at the same time, at least it was not as bad as what the IJ and IJN were. Let's
Yeah.
just so he has to concede there, and King pushes back of advancing through the Solomons, right, which was near the area of the first carrier battle in the world, the Battle of the Coral Sea,
Hmm.
right? Because he said, hey, there are air bases there. They can cause damage because there will be sufficient like 3-4 squadrons per base. We have to neutralize this, otherwise our supply lines and line of advance even for MacArthur's plan without anything would be completely threatened. And this, I'm pretty sure he did agree, but I'm pretty sure very reluctantly, just knowing his ego, because he did not come up with it or think about it. And then we have King propose his own campaign, which would end up being the start of the Guadalcanal offensive, the like in its most preliminary form as a plan. And you know, the biggest problem that came up was who's gonna command it. King was like, okay, the Navy should command it because it's gonna be amphibious assaults and everything. It'll be mostly surface our ships and marines fighting. MacArthur was like, no, I want to do it because it's closer to my realm of command, like by area. And then King's just like, yeah, we don't also need you. So that caused a huge um explosion from MacArthur, who accused the Navy of like trying to sabotage the army on purpose. But
Yeah.
I'll just say, hats off to General Marshall. I know, like, some aggressive generals in the US, like Patton, may not have had too much respect for a Washington politician of a general, that is Marshall. But the guy was very good at managing these egos. Like, I'll have to give him that because, working with King and MacArthur on a fairly regular basis must have been tiresome.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So ultimately, they do agree on the start of the Guadalcanal offensive. Basically, like it was a drive towards Rabaul, which was a major Japanese base in the region. With the first two phases, like one phase is the Guadalcanal and Solomon campaign offensive. The other is kind of like through New Guinea. The first one is kind of is given to the Navy's area, which right now would be under Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, and the second one will be to MacArthur and his Southwest Pacific forces. And then the third one, they just left it open just so that they don't have to deal with the issue for now,
Yeah.
for the command. So, now we know where the US Navy intends to strike. So, you have the build up there. But now the question is, why do the Japanese have so many air bases in that region or slash under construction? Well, it's just down to the decision of one particular admiral. That is, the commander of the Fourth Fleet at the time, um, Admiral. Sorry, Shigeyoshi Inoue. So he was a very air-minded commander. I'm sorry if I butchered his pronunciation, but Admiral Inoue, the commander of the Fourth Fleet at that time, was in charge of that entire region, and it was a fairly powerful fleet, but he was an air-minded commander. He was not the surface battleship commander. He believed, like, for Japan's new empire, they needed a lot of air bases to protect it. So he started building all these, air bases around the region, which is why the US did detect this threat. So the last line of air bases that were kind of going to be built would have been in the islands of Tulagi and Guadalcanal, which would also be the areas of the start of the Allied offensive. And initially it was only going to be Tulagi that was kind of going to get the airfield, but then they also realized Guadalcanal was amenable to build one. And that's where the Japanese half started construction of Henderson Field when the US Marines would land. Anyways, in a way, unfortunately, because after Midway, the Japanese have to reshuffle their fleets. They wanted to kind of put their stronger fleets a bit more closer to the home islands. So the Fourth Fleet was withdrawn, and he was actually relieved of command, actually. So, and he would basically take a staff role and then ministerial role for the rest of the war. So
Yes.
you have the Eighth Fleet now operating here, and they are under the command of Admiral Mikawa. Now, he's the only senior naval staff, or probably even the senior commander from both services, that actually believed the US would be striking back very soon. Because the rest of the Japanese believe that, the command staff believe, yeah, there's not going to be any action till, like, at a significant scale till 1943.
It was a conservative
But
estimate because the United States didn't have the capability to match the Japanese if they were to be contested in a place like the Solomon Islands. But as we will
Mhm.
see, the Americans gambled, and the Japanese did not believe the Americans would ever take gambles. So that was kind of their mindset.
It's kind of ironic because, in the build up to Pearl Harbor, also, the US also believed the Japanese would not gamble on such attacks because they believed Pearl Harbor would be sabotage and, Philippines would be the main thrust because they gambled on the fact or assumed the fact that Japan was incapable of doing multiple operations at once. So,
Yeah, that's true.
both sides have made this, error. But Mikawa was the only guy who believed, like, the attack is imminent. But unfortunately, if you just have one vice admiral just telling this while everyone else is like, no, you're not gonna win the battle.
Very
But
true.
and unfortunately, he never gets the time to prepare the defenses, even though he's continuing with Inouye's plans, because, well, lo and behold, the Americans decide to invade. So we have the start of Operation Watchtower, which will be Guadalcanal, and the start of Green Hell for many of the Marine, Navy, and Army personnel involved.
Hmm.
So, first they invade Tulagi itself, the island. It's slightly north of Guadalcanal. And then they start landing on Guadalcanal itself, and they meet very little resistance. Now,
Yes, because they've
here's the
taken the
thing
Japanese by surprise. Yeah.
completely, especially on the main island of Guadalcanal. That time, if I'm not mistaken, the heavier fighting was on Tulagi,
Yeah, on Guadalcanal,
where,
the Japanese were literally still building Henderson Field and they fled for their lives because they had no idea what was going on.
yeah, that's correct. And, you know, so they find it, and then the US also start building their base around Henderson Field, which is, I mean, so the airfield, which would soon be completed with the leftover Japanese equipment to Henderson Field. I should
Yeah,
add that.
literally using leftover equipment too. Yeah.
Yeah. But now this is where I think we start seeing some breakdown in the US command structure that led to the issues that would build up. First of all, I have to say, like, the area commander was not a very inspired choice. Vice Admiral Gongley. From what I read, like, he never really mediated in any of the debates his subordinates had, or I think I
Yeah,
call them confrontations rather than debates. I think debates is being a bit too kind when you have Admiral Turner involved.
very true.
But he never did there, and he was just a very pessimistic and indecisive or lethargic. It's just like he just did not have the stomach for the fight. I don't know, for a long time, because when you see, like, when Halsey takes over from him, the American effort both on land and sea in that region just, you know, does a 180 and starts going very offensive. So I think that was one issue. So he was not there when Admiral Turner and Fletcher in the planning stages had the disagreements about the carrier cover. Now, the main naval force, right? So everything regarding to the Navy, so that is the combat ships and the supply ships and the landing. The overall commander was the hero of Midway, Admiral Fletcher.
Which people are
He had,
surprised to hear, by the way. No one ever remembers him from Midway, even though he was the commander.
yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, but even though I think he only turned away formal command after the battle was, like, towards the end. But
Yeah.
at this time, it makes sense to give him carrier command because he is ultimately the most
Well,
experienced air air
senior
command
also.
senior. But I mean, he's the only guy that's commanded in two out of two battles for the U.S. Navy at this point, involving carriers. So, by
True.
seniority and experience, he does tick the box at this time. And let's also not forget, he also got his promotion to vice admiral for that.
Yes, that's true.
So the plan was while the Marines land and secure Jalaki and Guadalcanal, the carriers would be in the region to provide air cover for 10 days.
And
Right.
we
The
have to make
10,
sure the audience hears this. So there was a
yes,
plan, well
10
thought out.
days.
10 days was supposed to be the time that Fletcher would retain those carriers there in a very dangerous area.
True, it was a very dangerous area for carriers, but okay, if it was like going to be a point of contention, I do agree it should have been raised much earlier, because this is a serious consideration. But, I think maybe that was just the American military doctrine because an author I read, right, because this was related to Operation Husky. He said, like, in the British Army, the officers are able to question the plan at the conception stage itself, whereas
Yes.
the Americans never really did it, which is why, like, in
Hmm.
Husky, we saw, like, Patton agreed for the plans of Husky as it was, because, by doctrine, he was not supposed to question his superiors' orders,
Sure.
but he did not like it. So I guess that's probably why he may not have, spoke out against the plan, even though like from his memoirs, he completely believed that it was a badly designed plan in his view.
Although
Now, so
mind you, he's writing after the fact too. Anyways, but not to go into it.
true, true. But anyways, so as they land, right, like as Craig said, it's a very risky area because shallow waters is quite risky for carriers because the big ships need area to maneuver and evade. Shallow waters, not that great. And not to mention, it's easier for enemies to kind of mask themselves in their approach,
Yeah.
especially with around the islands and everything. So, and as I said, there are many air bases in the region. Although some, from where the carriers would be positioned, I think it would be at the extreme of their ranges unless, Japanese carriers would come down.
Yes, but the Americans didn't understand that. That is part of this. Like to give
The learning
Fletcher,
curve.
because there's going to be, I'm going to say it right now, there's going to be a lot of harassment of Fletcher in this podcast. If you wanted to
Yeah.
defend him a bit, there was some unknowns, and the biggest threat to the carriers, from his point of view, was land-based aircraft. They didn't know the full capability of the Japanese, how much aircraft they'd
Yeah.
be able to toss, and the effective range of their land-based aircraft. So there was some unknowns.
It was true, but like I said, if this was a serious problem, right? Like
Yeah.
the serious point of contention, the 10 days of air cover after the landings. Now, why would you need 10 days? Because this is to safely unload the supplies in an efficient manner from the transport ships to the beaches. So while the Marines are also not fully occupied on that, this will allow them time to spread out around and create their defenses also, so that it's not a compromising situation for them.
And this is
And
again the big first assault the United States Marines are really doing. They've never done anything on this scale before, so they had to kind of allocate a certain amount of days based off of what they're estimating it'll take to move the supplies. They don't even know if it'll be longer. So,
yeah, that is correct. And see, again, a lot of variables, as you said, but, you know, and this was the first one. So, that unfortunately the efficiency is also not going to be good, but he just announces that, hey, I know it was 10 days, but I'm just going to be here for 72 hours. Then I'm going to refuel and retire because my carriers are too exposed. And he also justifies it by saying refueling and,
re-
biding.
yeah, a
Admiral
reoccurring theme,
Nimitz's,
a very big
yeah,
reoccurring theme with Fletcher is an obsession with refueling.
I mean, it is a vital consideration, but, there's always a balancing act.
Yeah,
And like, see, the naval, like the battle later on, he did refuel, but that time I don't hold that fully against him because the intelligence picture kind of also fucked up for him.
yeah,
They mistimed the date, so you'll only do with what you have. But here, I think he could have held off, and he also quoted Admiral Nimitz. His principle of preserving his fleet unless you can take a heavy toll on the Japanese, right? Like Nimitz is
true.
fine, but the thing is, Nimitz is also quite a risk taker himself, but he's just more calculated because I'm pretty sure Fletcher was appointed Pacific Fleet Commander, And you have the intelligence breakthrough about what was target AF for Midway. I don't think Fletcher would have said, let's go.
That's
I
true.
genuinely think that. But this is what he uses to justify his withdrawal. And one thing I will also give Fletcher this, his carriers did lose about 20, 21 aircraft, right? So that's about 15% of their theoretical strength, because I think he had about three carriers here right now.
Yes.
Um, and mind you, these are like not the SX carriers, which would carry close to 100. So
No, these are still the early day carriers. Their capabilities and their aircraft
about
are not fantastic.
true. But so this is the situation, and the Marines are not too pleased about it. Neither is Admiral Turner, who also said, without the air cover, I'll have to withdraw my supply ships.
Yeah,
And
no,
I'm
it's
pretty sure Vandergrift was probably the angriest of the guy, because he felt, and I mean, like the Marines did feel like, the US Navy left them out to dry.
the
So,
Marines actually felt that the United States Navy had abandoned them. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And, so on the night that Fletcher left, right, and then the subsequent day, we would see the departure of Admiral Turner. This is like what was not landed, their reserve regiment, their heavy artillery, and much of the ammo, medical supplies, and rations. So I don't blame them one bit, because you've got most of the troops ashore, but they don't have much to fight back with. So even though we would see later, like the Japanese send smaller parties, they actually have a higher effective pound for pound combat strength at this point. It wasn't until
Yep.
like the US supply situation improved, you could push the American strength up. But so the carriers withdraw now, and at the same time, we have another situation. Two things I just need to talk about before we actually get to the battle. Admiral Mikawa has by now got the reports a couple of days ago of the initial landings at Tulagi and Guadalcanal, and he decides to go for a strike. Sail down the slot, right, as it was called, the Tokyo Express run slot, as it will later be known,
Later, but yeah.
and try to deal a beating to the United States Navy there. And so he's raised sail and is coming down. And at the same time, on the night of the Battle of Savo Island, which is, a few days after the landings, right? So this is the night of 8th August, because 9th August is when the supplies are going to be withdrawn, the supply ships. You have a meeting between the three most important commanders in the vicinity: General Vandergrift, Admiral Turner, and Admiral Crutchley. So Crutchley is actually an Australian admiral in charge of the surface forces protecting the Guadalcanal landing zone. So he has a force of about, I think 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers that are guarding all the supply ships. Now, this is where a major mishap, I will call it, happens, and a command failure, where the Crutchley does not inform his men that he's departing. So there is no one to take charge of the situation. So
Yes.
the stage is now set for a decisive encounter. I will call it, well, decisive in a battle sense, to take place.
Indeed. And just for the audience to know, if they're not aware, I happen to have two other podcasts that I do on behalf of kings and generals. So there's the Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China, and then of course there's the Pacific War week by week. So I write hundreds upon hundreds of pages, a lot of notes. So a lot of the podcasts that we do over on this channel is just me reusing a lot of those notes. So if you happen to have listened to the Battle of Savo Island over at the Pacific War week by week, I believe it was somewhere in episode 30 something territory. This is going to be quite reminiscent because it's the same source material. I just wanted to let the audience know. So it's not going to be too
I
much
don't
new
watch it
stuff.
from that episode. I just watch it in the supercard.
Yeah, there we go. So the situation we have now is, as you had said, Mikawa, he gets news. So he has to deal with the situation. Two things are happening. There's going to be some Japanese troops that are going to be sent to reinforce Guadalcanal because Guadalcanal was literally taken with its pants down. The Japanese, they fled Henderson Field. They're literally running into the jungles, leaving rations and all sorts of stuff that the Americans are going to take, by the way. It's a turn of events, kind of, compared to what usually happens. And now we're learning that the Japanese find after some of their aircraft have been, harassing the transports, moving the supplies and men onto Guadalcanal, that it seems the Allied forces are quite strong, a lot stronger than predicted, we'll say. So there's a lot of panic, especially coming from Tulagi. Admiral Mikawa, he has to decide what's going to be done. And he audaciously decides he's going to do a formidable counterattack with a surface fleet, despite the presence of American carriers, because they can see that there's an American cap over the area. So going in with a surface fleet against such a force, that's it's pretty bold. But one thing that the Japanese do have going for them is night training, something the Americans do not do. The Americans, of course, are relying on radar, but for the early half of the war, American radar is not very good, or at least the Americans don't know how to use it very well.
They don't. I think it's towards the second half of 1943, so at least a year off when we start seeing commanders who are able to master. Like first of all, you not only have commanders who know to use a radar properly in nighttime engagements, but you also have the better radar coming in because it's quite like watching some of your videos, right? It's quite insane to me that the Japanese lookouts will detect the American forces at the same distance that the radar detects at night, like at
Yes.
within a minute or so. And mind you, the Japanese are doing it by eye. They don't have
Well,
that radar.
we'll get
But
into it later in the episode. The Japanese invested in a different type of technology, we'll say, that wasn't radar. I mean, the Japanese did invest in radar, just not as much. They went a different route, and the Americans. The problem for them is while they are relying on radar, a lot of their admirals that are going to see combat in the early phase, they don't understand how to use it, and they impede on its use. And this is going to be one of those battles where you actually see that. So at 8:30 a.m., he signals orders to assemble. So he takes his flagship, the Chokai, with four other heavy cruisers, and he's going to prepare for a night attack upon the enemy ships around Guadalcanal. American radio intelligence intercepts this message, but they did not decode it properly until about quite later on, long after it would be of any use, mind you. Initially, Mikawa was not going to use light cruisers in his order of battle, seeing them more as a liability than an asset because of their age and the state of their training. Thus, these were kind of like the older Tenru or Yubari. But the senior staff officer, Commander Yamio Shinohara, he insists on their participation, forcing Mikawa's agreement, which is never a good thing because if you have older ships, it means they're probably slower and they're going to, impede on your overall action. Happens a lot. Meanwhile,
yeah,
Mika- Mikawa, he's waiting for his forces to gather, so he sends four submarines, to quickly hit the Allied shipping around Guadalcanal alongside the reinforcements for Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The 17th Army offered its confidence that they could easily expel the Americans from the Lower Solomons, which they will continuously do during the Solomon Islands campaign and not do so. Mikawa, he gathers a unit of 519 sailors with rifles, machine guns aboard the Meiomaru and the Soya, and he sends them on their way. However, he would be forced to recall them by August the 8th when he learns of the formidability, wow, had a brain fart there, of the American landing forces. Unfortunately, the Meiomaru, as she turns away, which is just roughly about 14 miles west of Cape St. George, the USS S-38 submarine, captained by Lieutenant Commander Henry Munson, he sees them and he manages to hit her with a torpedo, killing 373 men. It's a pretty devastating loss. And it's
and
a,
not to mention one of the rare occasions where the American torpedoes worked.
yeah, I was going to say, it's actually a rare instance in which the torpedoes worked because you had about a 15% chance, that they would explode, I'd say. During the morning of August the 7th, Mikawa and his fellow staff contemplated the dangers and the merits of attacking the Americans in the first place. The presence of American carriers and the absence of reliable naval charts proved it was going to be a dangerous operation. They hoped the 25th Air Flotilla would be capable of just dealing with the carriers so they wouldn't have to. They also had concerns about their potential striking force. 4 ships of Cruiser Division 6 constituted experienced teams, but none of the other ships had worked together before. Many of their staff felt that they lacked enough destroyers, but none of these factors deterred Mikawa from grabbing command and venturing onwards. Mikawa was an aggressive commander, by the way, and he would be a formidable admiral during the Pacific War. He would actually have quite a lot of success. Mikawa departed Rabaul around 7:40 p.m. on August the 7th, taking direct command of the striking force, and this comprised 5 heavy cruisers, the Chokai, Admiral Goto's 4 cruisers of the 6th Cruiser Division, the Oba, Furutaka, Gakko, Ginugasa, the 2 light cruisers Tenru and Yubai, which are quite old, and a single destroyer, the Unagi. During his advance towards Guadalcanal, Mikawa would launch his search with his cruiser floatplanes, gathering, a competent amount of information that was further aided by reconnaissance of land-based planes and the work of Japanese observers around Tassafaronga. And I just got to say, I am sorry to you, Gareth, and to my audience if you can hear my 4 parrots screaming their heads off. We usually don't do these
They,
podcasts early in the morning.
that's fine. I'm not able to
Yeah.
hear, so we're good.
Okay, good, because I don't know
But
how much you can pick it up. All I hear is the screaming, and I am in another room. They're really far away, but I think there's dogs outside, and my parrots are screaming at the windows. Like, all I hear is them screaming obscenities in French. So I hope I'll be able to edit out the screams. Mikawa, he's
uh,
gonna. Oh, sorry.
no, I say that's all good.
Mikawa's reconnaissance aircraft, they fly some missions from the 7th and the 8th, and they're searching, vainly for the American carriers. However, they were hiding unexpectedly under some clouds and, squalls around Guadalcanal. The reconnaissance did find 27 transports, and those are some tasty targets, mind you. Several destroyers off Guadalcanal, as well as 3 heavy cruisers and several destroyers off Talagi. It was an excellent sign that the enemy had separated into 2 groups. It means that you could attack them one by one. But they still
I would
didn't.
also just say one thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give credit to Mikawa, at least compared if you see like what happens with Nagumo at Midway. These are the
Yeah.
more comprehensive recon effort.
Yes, although I mean the circumstances are quite different. Nagumo, he had to be under radio silence and stuff. He was abiding because Nagumo was like a by the books
By the
admiral.
book.
He
Yeah.
just follows orders. I don't want to be mean. It's like he can't think for himself almost. He like he,
I know it's a doctrine, but again, the commanders have to take initiative. I
yeah.
mean, sometimes it's gonna because you'll have a plan. That's why, like Molka always said, no plan survives first contact. You have to be able to adapt. And I mean, it just looks like Mikawa with a smaller area obviously has done a more concentrated search and effort versus Negumo, which, if you just see what he did in the build up to Midway, it was just really more of a half-hearted attempt than an actual recon attempt to verify. So
That's
I
true.
think I just give credit to Mikawa for this.
Yeah, so it's a big looming issue. American carriers changed the entire outcome of the battle, and if anybody knows that, it's the Japanese, especially after Midway. You know, they had what we call victory disease going on before Midway, and now that's pretty gone. They know that they can get hit back. They know that they're a bit of a glass cannon, so I wouldn't call them scared, but they're more anxious now. Mikawa would break radio silence to ask the 25th Air Flotilla if they had spotted the carriers, but there was no reply, and that message would be found by the Americans. So this led Mikawa and his staff to estimate the enemy carriers had to be at least within 100 miles of Guadalcanal, and that they posed no real danger unless their striking force made its approach way too early. At 4 p.m., the striking force is now heading south, and they just left Bougainville Strait, entering the New Georgia Sound. Unbeknownst to the striking force, they're actually within range of 3 American carriers. At 4:42 p.m., Mikawa signals his battle plan. The striking force is going to penetrate the passage just south of the Savo Island to proceed and torpedo the enemy forces just off Guadalcanal. Then they would sweep over towards Tulagi to attack them with torpedoes, and then they would shell them before withdrawing north of Savo. It's a perfect action, and it's perfect for nighttime, and it's taking full advantage of the long lance torpedo. The attack
Yeah,
would.
and I
Oh, yeah.
think maybe just like for the audience, right? Like Savo Island is kind of like in the middle of the channel between
Yes,
Guadalcanal and Florida Island. Like, so Florida Island is a group where we have Chilaki, and Guadalcanal is where we have Henderson Field. So, you know, and you have this island in the middle called Savo. So that's exactly like, why we also have his battle plan of just basically going in a loop.
exactly. So the attack would begin at about 1:30 a.m. so that the striking force would be beyond a 120-mile radius from Savo Island, thus, very far away from retaliation, theoretically by carrier planes before sunrise. Because again, the American carrier planes are definitely not going to try and do something in pitch darkness. They're not capable of doing this at this point. Night fighting
I think if I'm
for
not mistaken, the US night fighting capabilities from carrier-borne aircraft only starts in 44. When
yeah,
you, I
and it
think,
uses modified Hellcats and stuff too. They're not capable at this point. It would be suicide.
yeah, and I think that was like, just before like the Central Pacific thrust, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a long way away.
Oh yeah. In light of the confined waters and the inexperience of some of his ships, Mikawa selects an elementary line of stern formation with 1,300 yards between vessels so that each ship can properly fire torpedoes and guns. By the way, we don't often think about this unless you're obsessed with naval doctrine, or maybe you play World of Warships, mind you. It is extremely difficult to line up your ships in a proper formation and to synchronize a torpedo salvo of multiple ships. So this is some pretty anxious stuff, I'd say. It was a very calm
So
voyage. Oh, yeah.
so it was just basically them following the leader.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's the format. Yeah,
Well, the simpler the better. And
true enough.
when it comes to the Japanese, especially with Yamamoto involved, they never make things simple, and that's where they screw up. Every time they make overly complicated things, synchronizing with different times and different ships in different locations, you're asking the more variables you put into it, the more you're asking for mistakes to be made. So
I
Mikawa
mean,
is trying to simplify it.
their plans were. I mean, Yamamoto's plans would work perfectly if the Americans responded as he hoped.
Yeah, exactly. Man, that's Midway in a nutshell. It was a calm voyage down the New Georgia Sound, and Mikawa's radiomen were eavesdropping on a lot of American carrier plane traffic. But as the night grew darker, the chatter petered out, indicating that the aircraft were on board their carriers, which is kind of like a duh moment. They know the Americans aren't going to be flying at night much. Sunset is going to come at around 6:15, and by 6:30, Mikawa sends a Nelsonian signal to his ships because, of course, he wants to be just like Yamamoto in that sense. And he states, in the finest tradition of the Imperial Navy, we shall engage the enemy in a night battle. Every man is expected to do his utmost. So it's the exact same thing that was said by, Admiral Nelson. It's the same thing that was said at the Battle of Tsushima, et cetera, et cetera. The
By
Japanese
Togo,
really love
yeah,
this. Yeah.
yeah.
So back over at the American side, the admirals they devised a multi-layered defense for their landing units. They expected an early detection, and they were relying on carrier planes to patrol the area to be, a threat to any of the Japanese ships that might venture towards Guadalcanal. They had picket destroyers equipped with radar, who would guarantee no hostile forces could sneak around Savo Island at night without, alarms being sounded. And they had a close screen of cruisers and destroyers to provide like a last line of defense. Now, within a 48-hour window, Mikawa turned all of his plans basically to ashes. The Allied air search was divided into a west group under MacArthur and an east group under Gormley. The RAF Hudsons were flying out of Milne Bay on New Guinea, southeast, as the Navy was sending their PBYs north and northwest. Despite all of these efforts, Mikawa's striking force literally just slips past most of them. But on the 7th, some B-17s raiding Rabaul, they catch a sight of them about 25 miles north of Rabaul on a westerly course. Another B-17 would later see them around the St. George's Channel and on a southern east course. And later that day, the S-38 submarine reported that some ships were passing over her. All of these reports did not reach Rear Admiral Richmond Turner until 7 a.m. on August the 8th. So it's quite late. I believe that was because the submarine could not surface to radio, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was generally the norm for the submarines at that time. They have to at least be on the surface and, you know, to transmit, because
Yeah,
even still right now, transmission, even in the clearest of circumstances, was quite primitive, I would call
definitely.
it.
Yeah, and
Right. So when you add in these variables, it's got to be so difficult for messages to come through.
definitely.
And one more thing we should also just add, about submarines. We always think of them as that, that invincible hunter in a way. It was almost, they just had that reputation of fear, but in actuality, if you have like a sufficient force, the submarines are like, yep, we're not coming near you.
Yeah, no, it just takes one Japanese sonar ping to find out there's a submarine in the location, and then it's just they can detach one or two destroyers just to depth charge the area, and it doesn't even impede on the overall movement of the striking force. So that submarine was in the right to hide. You can't surface at any time soon. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and just remember, folks, the destroyer was envisioned as the perfect submarine hunter, and it was.
it
You
definitely
know,
was,
and
especially
the reason they
Japanese,
could,
of course.
and the reason they could also do it is because sub destroyers are fast, so they can actually go bombard the submarine. And submarines underwater are slow. They can just drop depth charges, ram it if it surfaces or whatever, and then just quickly rejoin the fleet. No
Yeah.
problem at all.
Yeah, the Japanese actually really liked ramming submarines too. That was a big thing they'd love to do. Thus, Mikawa's force, they wiggled right through the holes in this Allied air defense. You could say it's a bit of luck. Now, remember, the carriers, they were going to leave after 3 days of the landing operations. So when the Japanese start sending airstrikes against the landing operations, it made Admiral Fletcher kind of even more jittery than usual. And he's a jittery admiral, I'd say.
Um,
Upon,
there's one more thing I'll just add about the Allied air cover. Admiral Turner had also requested Admiral McCain, who was commanding the naval air assets in the area, for a detailed reconnaissance as well, around the
yeah,
time, just before the battle. The thing is, he wanted that, I think it's because of the submarine sighting, he wanted that extra reconnaissance done over the slot. But, McCain never conducted these missions, nor did he ever this info to Turner that I'm not done it.
true.
But because of that, Turner said, "Oh, yeah, he must have done it and nothing to report, so we're good."
That's true.
That was pretty much it.
Hmm.
But at the same time, McCain, we cannot also fully fault him, because unfortunately the US don't have many air assets in the region.
It's true.
And from where his reconnaissance aircraft are based, going and reconnoitering the slot is the extreme range of theirs. So, and also like right now you had, like parts were also a little bit short because they just reached the region. But, there's one thing we can put a blame on Turner and Crutchley. The cruisers had 15 float planes of their own.
That's true.
Those were not those were not deployed. Now that is actually a big uh failure, if you
Yes,
ask
it
me.
is.
Because Mikawa did it, and he had much fewer float planes in comparison.
Psst. Hey, you. You ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan, and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it. Without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Yeah, that's true. Well, I guess the Americans weren't as comfortable flying at that certain time of day. But
Yeah.
upon seeing the Japanese aircraft that were using torpedoes, Admiral Fletcher proposed taking the carriers out on August the 8th. Yeesh. So at 6:07 p.m., he sent word to Admiral Gormley and Turner, and he stated this: fighter plane strength reduced from 99 to 78. In view of a large number of enemy torpedo planes and bombers in this area, I recommend the immediate withdrawal of my carriers. Request tankers be sent forward immediately as fuel remaining low. 30 minutes later, Fletcher, he took his force, Task Force 61, out of harm's way, going southeast. Ever since this decision, Fletcher has been met with a ton of scorn. I can tell you, any book that's written about the Pacific War, they love to just shit on Fletcher. And unfortunately, as for Gormley was concerned, the retirement of the carriers was due to fuel shortage. As you just heard that message, that's the impression you get from it. It would prove to be bullshit later. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of Ian Toll, because I remember a lot of these notes come from his latest trilogy series, and he's a very opinionated author, historian, I'll say. Fletcher's carriers did have enough fuel to operate for several more days. He was just trying to make an excuse to get out of there. I'm not going to say that's 100% accurate, but that's the feeling of a lot of historians. I've
The thing
read it a
is,
lot.
if with 78 aircraft out of 99, he's taken some losses, but it's not crippling.
Definitely. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not like, you've gone down from 99 to 48, 58.
Basically, though, what most authors will tell you, or even contemporaries, people that were admirals who knew Fletcher, his number one priority was to retain the carriers. Carriers were the most prized possession now in the Navy. They had overthrown the battleship. So
Yeah.
Fletcher was afraid he was going to be the admiral that lost some carriers. And at Midway, they had took some losses already. And he got cold feet. He wasn't the kind of guy that liked to gamble at all. He wasn't a very aggressive commander, like Halsey, for example, or Spruance. So, yeah, that's kind of
It's
why.
kind of crazy. He's a bit scared about losing more carriers. He's already lost 2.
It's true. So,
I mean, even though
yeah.
he's given out a beating back, let's give him that much,
Definitely, yeah. Like people
So,
forget he was involved in some of the biggest fighting. Still,
so far,
I mean, he's
2
very
carries.
hated. He's very hated for this exact moment. It's this moment onwards where he gets a really bad reputation.
It's sad, like the fall from grace so quickly for like a guy who would have been like a hero in a way.
Yeah. Well, there
But
was a guy
yeah,
who wrote an essay talking about the experience of Fletcher and Nagamo after Midway, because they both have kind of similar career
he,
downfalls.
yeah, I think Nagumo would later in the Guadalcanal campaign command one. I don't remember which of the naval engagements, but basically it's a failure.
Well,
And
the thing is, Isaro Yamamoto had to retain Nagamo because of his rank, and because technically he on paper had won so many battles, but Yamamoto had no faith in him anymore and just wanted to kind of just, shove him somewhere else. He couldn't do it right away.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Yamamoto and Nagumo personally detested each other.
Well, it
And
wasn't Yamamoto
Nagu-
didn't detest him off the bat.
Oh,
Nagumo
that's what I
detested
heard.
Yamamoto.
Oh, okay.
So
But and I
inevitably,
know
Yamamoto's going to hate him. Yeah, eventually.
and and if I'm not mistaken, Nagumo was actually a torpedo specialist rather than an aviation
Yes.
specialist. But just because seniority is like, oh yeah, let's give him the key to Butai.
Yeah, that was another big problem with the Japanese High Command. So Nagamo was a senior admiral, and he had little to no experience aviation, and they gave him control of the strongest air fleet arm in the world had ever seen. So yeah, it's well, the results speak for themselves. But Nagamo, he for 6 months, he ran a train on everything. It was success over success over success until Midway. So
Yeah.
yeah,
But even by Fletcher also being there, it's also like, a black shoe admiral is still in command of the US carrier forces at this
exactly.
moment.
Yeah, exactly. As as some people who listen to this podcast religiously would say, my friend Ian always makes a thing about the black shoes when it comes to this, and Fletcher is the greatest example. Like he keeps coming up in our podcast discussions. I hate to like shit on the guy because it's kind of comical at some points, but yeah, this is where it starts. This is where people really start to hate Fletcher, and his career is going to go just south from here. So it's August the 8th. Darkness is upon them. It's been 2 days of bitter air attacks, and the transports, they received some damage. Some of the destroyers have been hit too. So he's expecting that August the 9th is just going to be a lot worse. He was also receiving reports from Admiral Nimitz that the Japanese sending submarines to try and attack shipping off Tulagi, which they were. Though these would kind of be false alarms in the end. Turner that night was relying on some contact reports that told him there was the presence of at least 2 seaplane tenders and a Japanese task force was soon approaching. This, as we know, was wrong, and unfortunately, Turner believed them. Seaplane tenders were quite slow, so Turner gauged that they would not reach Guadalcanal that night. So Turner concluded that the Japanese were planning to set up like a seaplane base at Ricardo Bay or on Santa Isabel Island to launch a torpedo attack against them. He requested Admiral McCain would attack Ricardo Bay at dawn. Turner called for a meeting aboard his flagship, the one actually I think you were talking about, where it was Vandegrift and the British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, who was commanding a screening force of 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 5 minesweepers. The British admiral had divided his forces into 3 groups. So Rear Admiral Norman Scott was leading the Eastern Force, and this would include the light cruiser San Juan, Australian light cruiser Hobart, the destroyers Buchanan and Monson, and this was sealing the eastern approaches between Florida Island and Guadalcanal. Captain Frederick Reichholf's northern group had the heavy cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, and destroyers Helm and Wilson. They were guarding the northwestern entrance. Lastly, under the personal command of Admiral Crutchley, was the southern group, and they had the Australian heavy cruisers Australia and Canberra, the heavy cruisers Chicago, and the destroyers Bagley and Patterson. So they're guarding the southwestern approaches. So you kind of had all your bases, covered. In addition, Crutchley had positioned 2 destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot, to patrol the area west of the southern and northern groups. These 2 destroyers had SC radar mounts, and like all early radars at the time, this equipment required a great deal of experience from their operators to achieve maximum performance. And that's kind of the thing here. They have the equipment, but they don't really have the know-how. So the SC radar was capable of ranges between 4 to 10 miles, but very few officers could use it very well. And Crutchley's the way that he deployed his picket lines, this kind of undermined the scope of the radar. So when Turner heard all of Crutchley's formation plans, he had approved of it, but he himself was not very familiar with radar technology. It would turn out in the future, setting 4 ships instead of 2 destroyers for the radar picket line patrol would have been a much better choice. But in the end, the 2 transport groups in the respective screens were separated by 15 to 20 miles. Turner split his flag officers amongst the 2 groups, and he would remain with the Guadalcanal group and Admiral Scott with the Tulagi group. So this left Crutchley with the screen. Mikawa's strike force off Savo Island enjoyed a moonless night with an overcast, which is absolutely perfect conditions to sneak over. he was further bolstered by reports from the 25th Air Flotilla that they had just sunk 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 9 transports that very day, which again is
A
classic
false alarm.
bullshit. Yeah, it's just
I
classic
mean,
bullshit.
it's like listening to your episodes and just you just hear the reports. Like I know all sides are guilty of
But
exaggerations.
the Japanese are the
Or,
most ridiculous, for sure.
I mean, I think if I remember, I think it was the naval battle of Guadalcanal, which later, like couple of months later, would turn the naval tide in this region, right?
Yes, yes.
I think what they told Tokyo HQ. Oh yeah, we've sunk 3 carriers, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers.
It's
You
like
might as well just
more
say
than the Pacific Fleet. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I was just gonna say, he's like, oh yeah, British and Americans also said their Atlantic fleets, we sunk them completely.
Yeah, it's the Japanese. I mean, the Americans do the exact same thing, but the Japanese are ridiculous with
I
they
mean,
always do it.
all sides do it, but it's just the scale that is what I just want to emphasize.
Yeah. So poor Mikawa, he has no reason not to believe them. He's really boosted in confidence now, and he's convinced that he has the upper hand. So he's coming in this guns a-blazing. So at 11:15 p.m., his troops catapult 4 float planes to just scout ahead, and they're using flare illumination, and they spot 3 Allied cruisers south of Savo Island. So at midnight, the Japanese, they took to their battle stations, and they increased their speed to 26 knots. At 12:50, Chokai's lookouts, they spot Blue, slowly moving 5 miles away, and Blue is completely oblivious to the many guns directed upon her at this moment. Then Chokai's lookouts, they spot the Ralph Talbot. It was the first time, but would not be the last, that the Japanese lookouts, they spotted the Allied ships before the radar had spotted them. Now, to explain to the audience what's going on here, I keep saying that the Japanese specialize in night fighting. They actually technically have something that one could call night vision. It's not the the green goggles from Jurassic Park kind of night vision that we're talking about that comes out in the 90s. But what they've done is it's actually pretty cool. They have these enormous, the only way to describe them is they're giant binoculars, and they have Japanese guys that are basically trained to or are picked. They're selected because they have good night vision to use these huge binoculars. So you have to imagine they're like huge brass and steel binoculars, and they're on all the warships, and they're as big. I guess you could say you could like almost fit like a human head inside them. They're that big. Their lenses absorb to like 980 times more light than the human eye, offering
Wow.
the ability to see things about 20 miles away. Many of these
So,
were oh yes.
so I guess this is why, to my earlier point, where I said, they would be detecting the American forces themselves. Like when the Americans pick up radar contact within a couple of minutes, the Japanese are also alerted that, there are vessels nearby.
Yep.
And they have estimated this not due to radar, but night vision.
Yeah. And kind of a cool piece of trivia. These were built by Nippon Kogaku, a supplier that would later become known as Nikon, the camera company, which
Oh,
I don't know if
that's,
is yeah. Don't know if that's
that's actually
relevant.
nice.
I don't know if that's relevant for Gen Zs today, because they, didn't grow up where you had to go and like get the film out of the camera kind of thing. But Nikon, of course, has always been a huge company in the industry of cameras.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember those days. Damn, I'm also feeling old now.
On top of the excellent binoculars, the IGN, they train specifically for night combat on top of that. So they have tactics for night and how to use their equipment, which is kind of like, let's look at the other side here. We got Americans who have this radar equipment, but they don't really know how to use it, versus the Japanese who have this different type of equipment, but they fully know how to use it and they're trained to use it. So the spotters, they're carefully selecting, their targets. And by the way, the crews, they're drilled to use searchlights or flares dropped from spotter planes to illuminate the targets to, increase the chances of like fully shooting on these things. So it's basically the Japanese have the upper hand. Like you could almost say the fog of war is only on the Americans at this point. The destroyer and cruiser crews are also trained specifically for nighttime torpedo tactics. Now, for those who don't know, the Japanese have the greatest torpedo in the world at this point, the Type 93 long lance torpedo. It's the deadliest night weapon that exists. before the widespread introduction of the United States fire control radar systems and their tactics and doctrine, the Japanese just are basically exploiting the situation. So they're using their night fighting training to just crush the Americans. During
I
the
think, I'll just add one thing about the superiority of, the long lance. The long lance, right?
Yeah.
The range, which was something, for a long time, the US captains, commanders, everyone underestimated was its range.
Yep.
Because its maximum range at a speed of 49 knots. Okay.
It's insane. Yeah.
Okay, at that rate, so 49 knots, folks, is 56 miles an hour in the water. They could just drop it. It had a range of 11 nautical miles. So that is about 12.5 miles. And
Yeah.
if they kind of like basically just slightly double the range and reduce the speed to 36 knots, you have an incredible long range striking weapon.
Yeah, it's so
Especially
long that
considering the US don't have a torpedo reply to the Japanese right now.
the range was so long that for most of the early half of World War II, the Americans assumed that they were being hit by Japanese submarines that they just couldn't find.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I really love that, torpedoes.
Yeah.
It's-
To go further into some of this technology stuff, during the 1930s and the 1940s, the United States and Britain, they would focus on developing radar, particularly Britain. Britain was, I'd say, the most impressive one with early radar. The Japanese, they had this technology. They just weren't really enthusiastic about using it. They didn't really believe it would give them superiority. And they had invested so heavily in the optics of binoculars, so it just led them to think that they wouldn't necessarily need the radar. Until the middle of 1943, the Japanese lookouts trained for, this night vision, we'll call it. They did better than the Americans, but American search radar and their operators would get better. So you're seeing a dramatic turn in 1943 where now the Americans were going to have the advantage and radar is going to outpace the night vision capabilities of the Japanese. But for now,
Yeah.
for the early half of the Pacific War, the Japanese kind of will say that
Yeah,
nighttime is theirs.
it's not till like, I would say like September, October of next year that the Americans start taking the lead.
Yep. But excuse me, back to the battle. Mikawa shaped a series of courses to try and hide his movements. And then at 1:30 a.m., he orders all of the ships to attack, and he increases the striking force speed to 30 knots, which is really fast. At about this time, Unagi became detached from the formation and lost sight of her sister ships ahead of her because she was pretty old and slow. So Unagi hauls it west and probably avoids running into the enemy. A minute later, after the call to attack, Chokai saw a cruiser to report, and this was the Jarvis, which had been crippled by a Betty earlier that day and was just limping out of the area. So, pressing upon his luck, Mikawa held fire, which is very ballsy, and because he's really close to the to that ship, especially in range of the Furutake, he seizes the opportunity to fire torpedoes at Jarvis instead. It's unsuccessful; they don't manage to hit him. 2 minutes later, Chokai then sees three cruisers about almost 13,000 yards off her starboard bow, and this forces Mikawa to order independent firing to begin. Chokai's commander, Captain Hayakawa, he cries out for fire torpedoes to the starboard. 4 long lance fish, they go out, and the lookouts report seeing the flagship Vincennes to the northeast. Chokai then breaks silence by firing a salvo at the Canberra. And soon after, you got to imagine it's just mayhem. Flares start blossoming everywhere, especially over the transports off Guadalcanal, illuminating the entire southern group. Aboard the Allied screening ships, I mean, you got these sailors that aren't expecting a battle. Suddenly, Ralph Talbot is the first to see a float plane low over the Savo Island, heading east towards Tulagi, and she broadcasts, "Warning, warning, plane over Savo, headed east." But the message never reaches the southern group because they lack TBS radios, which is a oof kind of moment there. At 1:43,
At least they have a different radio, unlike the Italian tanks.
yeah, exactly. At least they have the radios. At 1:43 a.m., a lookout in Canberra's crow nest faintly makes out what looks to be a ship just 4,500 yards away, which is really, really close, and it's most likely the Chokai. 30 seconds later, the lookout spots torpedo tracks as two ships suddenly materialize off her port bow, just a few thousand yards away. You really got to imagine what it would be like to all of a sudden be that close to the enemy. It would be terrifying. A minute later,
This is like literally taking those jump scares to the next level.
seriously, flares illuminate the Canberra as the Chokai begins shelling her, and the Futatake quickly follows suit with her guns and torpedoes. A minute after, the Oba adds her guns and fires 3 torpedoes at Canberra, and Nikako joins in the firing upon the Canberra and the Chicago. Within just 4 minutes, Canberra has sustained 24 hits from 5 enemy ships. Her boiler rooms are knocked out, killing all of her power for armaments, her pumps, and her firefighting equipment. Shells are smashing her 4-inch, guns on her deck, silencing her deck crews before they even have a chance to fire back. Her torpedo crews fared a little bit better as shells hit her hull, quickly listing her to 30 degrees. By about 1:50 a.m., Canberra was coasting to a halt, and she's basically a bonfire. So she's ablaze right now. Now, the Chicago is watching in horror as the Canberra is just being killed in front of her, and she's being battered by torpedoes and by shells, and the Jarvis is being chased. Chicago turns hard to starboard, seeing the torpedoes coming her way now, but by 1:47 a.m., a torpedo from the Kako smashes into Chicago's starboard bow. Then a second thuds against her but fails to explode, which is unusual for the Japanese long lance, by the way. Even the long lance can have duds. Despite the numerous flashes of enemy guns, the Chicago crews could not fix their sights upon any target. Again, the Japanese night fighting capabilities are at the forefront here. A pair of star shells remedied this problem just before a shell pierced her main mast and exploded over her forward funnel, wounding about 13 men and killing 2. By 1:49 a.m., Chicago observes Patterson is locked in action with enemy ships, and she joins her with her 5-inch guns, landing a hit on the Tenru, killing about 23 and wounding 21. Chicago then swept her 2 searchlights to reveal only an empty sea. Captain Bode, aboard the Chicago, is standing there as he looks to the west at the battle ledge south of Savo, and to make matters worse, he's not even reporting anything that's going on about his encounter, because these ships are quite far apart, so not everybody's aware of what's going on. At about 1:49, the destroyer Bagley, he sees that the enemy is there. He tries to fire 4 torpedoes and he misses with all of them. Meanwhile, the Patterson of the Southern Group sights an enemy ship at 1:46. It's most likely the Futataka, and he sounds general quarters. He also tries to signal Canberra and Chicago by the blinker light, stating, "Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor." As Commander Walker was about to yell and order the crew of Patterson to fire torpedoes, his voice is washed over by guns going off. Patterson's then begins a duel with the Tenru and the Yubari, using his searchlight to illuminate the enemy, who are zigzagging to avoid salvos. At about 1:48 a.m., an enemy shell knocks out 2 of her 5-inch guns, starting a fire and killing 10 men. The Japanese thought that she was already sunk, but Walker's crew managed to put the blaze out, and a minute later they're back to firing their 5-inch guns in defiance against the 2 enemy ships. Now, while this duel is going on, Patterson's gun crews notice enemy cruisers are heading east, and they take a shot at one of them. It's believed to be the Kunagasha at about 1:56 a.m. So Mikawa has demolished the Southern Group by this point in roughly 7 minutes of combat, and he now sees the Northern Group, with his formation unintentionally split in 2. Following Chokai was the Oyoba, Kako, and Kinugasha. They begin heading east. Chokai fires 4 torpedoes towards the Vincennes at about 12,000 yards away before turning to engage the Northern Group. So meanwhile, the Canberra lurches across the original Japanese path, forcing the Furataka to swerve hard to port. Most likely because of this, the other 3 Japanese ships that are following the Furataka forming a Western group. This is unintentional. They're just kind of following the one in front of them. Happens a lot in naval
because I'm
battles.
guessing, because I guess you have to keep in line, and especially in the night,
Yeah.
As I've seen, it goes into mayhem in the day itself. So
At night, it's, this isn't like a Letty Gull situation where no one knows where they're going, but if you have a choice between just following a friendly ship in front of you or going off on your own, you always follow the friendly ship because you could run into, a friendly ship or something. You don't know what'll happen. It's just unsafe to do your own thing.
Yeah.
And it's not combat effective by any means because you don't know who you're shooting. Now, at 1:55 a.m., they get into a formation to fire torpedoes, and the Furutake takes the lead by illuminating the Quincy with their searchlights, and they begin to open fire. 3 minutes before the chaos had even begun, the northern group, led by the Vincennes, had been performing a box patrol. The three cruisers' captains had actually been fast asleep when at 1:44 a.m., the crews began literally to, feel underwater explosions going off, and it was Japanese torpedoes just blowing up everywhere. The crews had shrugged this off as anti-submarine actions by the southern group, but a minute later, they began seeing flares and they heard gunfire to the south. Slowly, they begin to stir the crews. Captain Rykov on the Vincennes gets to his bridge. From the bridge, no one can see the Canberra or the Chicago being completely destroyed, but they can see gun flashes going off. Rykov then he rightly guesses the enemy must be smaller ships using 5.5-inch guns. So basically, these are destroyers, maybe like cruisers. And he was receiving no contact reports from the southern group. So he appraises the situation. It must be Japanese light units are in battle with the southern group. He also reasons that this might be a decoy to lure him away from the North Passage, so Rykov decides to increase his speed to 15 knots, but to allow the situation to simply develop. He's being cautious. It was around 1:50 a.m. when suddenly searchlights from the southeast illuminated his three cruisers, the Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, and he assumes this must be the southern group. So he begins to send radio signals asking them to stop illuminating him. Little did he know this was the Japanese, of course, and the shells begin to fall all around his ships. I can tell you, this
Well, I
happens
think
quite
that
often.
I guess now, at least he should have the confidence that, yeah, this is not the Southern group for sure.
Yeah. I mean, in nighttime engagements, this is often the case. No one wants to be the guy that shoots a friendly ship because, I mean, you're going to get court-martialed. So everyone wants to radio signal just to make sure. And, well, it's going to bite him in the ass here. Jokai's light was latched onto Astoria, and Admiral Mikawa noted with pleasure that the guns were well trained on the ship already when he ordered commence firing. Just before 1:51 a.m., the Japanese flagship tossed the first salvo at the Astoria, while Keiko rapidly fired upon the Vincennes. Ioba was the third ship to open fire and managed to hit the Quincy with the first three rounds. Keiko's gunner crews could see the fires gnawing aboard Vincennes, but after 1:55 a.m., Mikawa what was once a neat formation, it began to disintegrate. Chokai went about 28 degrees, and Admiral Godo, aboard the Elba, ignored the course change by the flagship, keeping himself on a northerly course, so they're kind of drifting further apart. The Chokai then begins to fall off the starboard hand, and it steams into some trouble. In the rear of the American formation, the Astoria had been the first to assume the enemy were friendly ships, and that they were accidentally firing upon them. So for 4 precious minutes, she withheld her fire. Then the crews realized this is the enemy. So, or, they're firing on us regardless, so they're going to begin to fire themselves. But this squander kind of earned Astoria a shell from the Chokai before anything, and it hit her in the hangar and the boat deck, making her more of an illuminated target. The Chokai began scoring many hits then at about 2 a.m., and Astoria began to take concentrated fire from all the Japanese ships. I mean, you have to imagine if one ship is lit on fire, then it just becomes a target for everybody else. A cascade of hits.
It's just a beacon, especially
Exactly.
in the night. And as you said, no, moonless sky. It's like,
And
gonna
it's so different from daytime fighting because sometimes when a ship takes many hits and there's like a fire lit, it causes so much smoke in the air that it actually covers the ship. So it dissuades people from firing upon it if they can clearly see other ships around. But at nighttime, it's if you're taking hits, you're going to get more and more hits. It's a completely different situation. So as we see, it's a cascade of hits that are like taking out her communications, her fire room, disabling her guns. It's igniting large parts of her midsection. By about 2:11 a.m., Astoria's course bends to about 185 degrees, and 4 minutes later, her power goes out. and her bridge is losing steering control. Astoria fires a salvo aiming for the Kunigasa, but sails right over her, smashing into Chokai's foremast main battery turret, killing about 15 men. Astoria then glides just half ablaze. So, of all the Northern group ships, it was the Quincy who impressed the Japanese the most, but would pay for it the most. When the Japanese searchlights had illuminated the Americans, Captain Moore, aboard the Quincy, increased his speed to 15 knots, and he began firing upon all of these searchlights immediately. Quincy was hit by many salvos on her fantail before 1:53 a.m. and shortly upon her bridge. One salvo hit her 5-inch cartridge case and on her gun number 4, killing many men. Then at about 1:55 a.m., a shell smashed a float plane in her well deck, spraying gasoline everywhere, soon causing more and more fires. The Furutaka and the Tenru began to crossfire Quincy at about 2 a.m. Captain Moore realized he was being overtaken by both sides, by 2 columns of Japanese ships, and in order to avoid a collision with the Vincennes, he gallantly took Quincy out of the American column and he headed straight into the Eastern group, which is quite a badass thing to do. He shouted to his
Like,
crew.
damn the consequences, full torpedoes ahead.
Exactly. So he shouts to his crew, "We're going to go down between them and give them hell." To the Japanese, Quincy is like a blaze, lurching out of formation as if he's going to ram one of them, and he's firing his forward guns. The Japanese admire this spirit as they concentrate all of their fire upon the Quincy. So at 2:04 a.m., 2 torpedoes slam right into the Quincy. These are coming from the Tenru, and it slashes open her port side. Quincy staggers forward, firing a salvo at the Keiko, but overshoots it. The salvo actually smashes into the Chokai, killing and wounding 36 men, turning the flagship chart room into embers. So Quincy takes another hit to her bridge at about 2:10 a.m., and this mortally wounds Captain Moore, and it kills most of his staff. One by one, the guns begin to be silenced on the Quincy, and by 2:16 a.m., she's hit by another torpedo, this time by the Oba, and it strikes her starboard side. The Eastern group ceases fire upon her because she's obviously sinking. Aboard the Quincy, Lieutenant Commander John D. Andrew, he went down to the bridge to assess the situation, and I have a rather long quote from what he saw. So here it goes. "When I reached the bridge level, I found it in shambles of dead bodies with only 3 or 4 people still standing. In the pilot house itself, the only person standing was a signalman at the wheel who was vainly enduring to check the ship's swing to starboard to bring her to port. On questioning him, I found out that the captain, who at the time was laying near the wheel, had instructed him to beach the ship as he was trying to head for Savo Island, distant some 4 miles on the port quarter. I stepped to the port side to the pilot house, and I looked out to find the island and noted that the ship was heeling rapidly to port, sinking by the bow. At that instant, the captain straightened up and fell back, apparently dead, without having uttered any sound other than a moan." So the survivors of the
That's
Quincy, the survivors of the Quincy began
just
to run.
sometimes you read these
Go for it.
read these comments of any soldier, regardless of the side, when they give these descriptions, it's quite harrowing.
Oh yeah, when ships get hit, it's pretty bad. The
Yeah.
survivors of the Quincy, they begin to run to the lifeboats, and by 2:38 a.m., Quincy begins to sink into the waters, giving them a new name, Iron Bottom Sound. So the Vincennes suffered many hits as well at the offset of the battle, and it saw the Japanese Eastern group trying to cross their T. So Rykov ordered an increase to speed to 20 knots. Vincennes gunners made a hit on the Kunigasa on her steering gear, with a second salvo causing the cruiser to begin wobbling. As Rykov was about to order the ship to make for 25 knots at a roughly 1:55 a.m., Chokai landed a torpedo hit on her port side. Furutaka and the Tenru concentrated fire upon her at 2 a.m., and then 3 minutes later, the Vincennes was hit by another torpedo from the Yubari, hitting her number 1 fire room. A gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Adams, informed Rykov that they had lost all their guns, so the captain tried to conceal the ship with smoke, but no surviving engineers were in position to carry out the order. Eesh. Rykov still held hope. It was not the enemy, but friendlies firing upon them, so he ordered a new set of colors to be hoisted. Oddly enough, this was met by 7 minutes of respite. But then at 2:13 a.m., Chokai searchlights illuminated the Vincennes again, and for 3 minutes, salvos pummeled her. By 2:30 a.m., Rykov ordered abandoned ship, and the Vincennes was hissing to her grave just before 3 a.m. Now, the destroyer Wilson saw the action of the battle and began to open fire on Kako's searchlight before shifting her fire upon the Aoba and the Chokai. Her gunfire provoked counterfire from the Chokai and the Tenru, but she would only suffer some scratches and shrapnel. Close by was the destroyer Helm, who received a message at 2:10 a.m. ordering all the destroyers to rendezvous at a pre-designated area just off Savo Island, so she was proceeding there. The twin columns of Japanese warships were heading northeast when they ran into the Ralph Talbot. The destroyer was on her southwest leg of a patrol at around 2:10 a.m. when the Unagi illuminated her with a searchlight, showcasing the poor destroyer to the entire western group of Japanese cruisers. That sucks. By 2:16, they began to open fire on her, and the Ralph Talbot's #1 torpedo mount was hit. Lieutenant Commander Callahan ordered the ship to speed up and just zigzag, to try and save her. And in quick succession, the Ubari scored 5 hits on the Ralph Talbot, disabling her guns, her torpedo controls, her radar, killed 14 of her crew, including the ship's doctor. At 2:32 a.m., the enemy suddenly stopped firing, and the searchlights went off. Turns out the Western group received an order to retire. Ralph Talbot had a power failure and was crawling closer to Savo Island. Her repair crews were freaking out. Now, the Unagi had peeled out of the Japanese column, as I had mentioned, at 1:43 a.m., and was heading west when she ran into the Jarvis. Unagi closed in close enough to see a large gaping hole in the Jarvis's side, so she opened fire at 1:55 a.m. She also launched torpedoes, which failed to hit the ship, which is surprising since the ship would have been not moving very well. After 5 minutes of gunfire, Unagi went to hunt somewhere else. At 2:16 a.m., Mikawa consulted his staff, and although the Japanese had only suffered, honestly, very light damage, and they possessed still 60% of their shells, their unit formation was all over the place. They were in quite a lot of disarray, and half of their torpedoes were gone. Mikawa and his staff estimated that it would take about 2 hours to assemble, to head over to hit the American transports, leaving just an hour until daylight. They assumed the American carriers would be hastening northeast to smash them. If they left immediately, they could still anticipate an air attack, but it would find the striking force already about 120 miles up in the North Georgia Sound, a distance they might manage to, tug away from the American carriers. However, they were confident they had already won a great victory here. In many ways, they did. The IGA had already assured them they would clean the stranded American Marines off Guadalcanal. So, unfortunately for the Japanese, at 2:20 a.m., Mikawa ordered a retirement. This would prove to be an egregious error. Mikawa felt confident in their success, but many of his fellow captains did not believe so. During the swing around the northern group, Captain Saiwa emptied Kinogashi's starboard torpedo tubes at the transports over 13 miles off of Tulagi. Not a single one hit. As Mikawa ordered the withdrawal, Captain Hayakawa of the Chokai tried to persuade him to renew his attack to sink the transports, which were the initial target, by the way. These were what they really should have been attacking. By 3:40 a.m., the striking force had reassembled and their crews had all shifted to anti-aircraft positions. Meanwhile, Commander Omai gathered reports of all the ships and concluded that they had sunk 5 Allied cruisers and 4 destroyers. As they sailed at 9:58 a.m., Mikawa detached Cruiser Division 6 without escort for Keving, while the others went through the Bougainville Strait, and some ships made their way for Rabat. Cruiser Division 6 was triumphantly sailing away on the morning of August 10th when Lieutenant Commander John Moore's submarine S-44 fired 4 torpedoes just 700 yards away, hitting the Kako 3 times, sinking her in 5 minutes. Her sister managed to pick up most of the crew, but it was a devastating loss, to be sure. Now, the Canberra...
That's quite anticlimactic in a way.
It is, after that engagement. Yeah. Back to the poor Canberra, who lay motionless with a sharp list and multiple fires. Destroyer Patterson came over to, try and hose her down to put out some of the fires. It was of no use. At 5:15 a.m., Commander Walsh ordered abandoned ship. Admiral Turner gave the sad order to the Selfrig to scuttle the ship, and in a typical American fashion, all the torpedoes launched were duds. They failed to explode. So yeah, the torpedo problem was very apparent.
I think this is a good highlight of that issue.
Yeah. So yeah, they ended up having to shell the ship down. 8 a.m. it finally sinks. The Astoria looked like she might survive, and her crews were like wrestling with her, but explosions began to go off, secondary explosions that is, and she would eventually sink as well. Admiral Fletcher's carriers reversed course to the northwest at 1 a.m. while awaiting Gormley's verdict on their retirement. The first flash reports of the battle reached the task force at around 3 a.m. Shortly after 3:30 a.m., Gormley ratified the withdrawal, and 30 minutes later, the task force was heading southeast again. Captain Forrest Sherman of the Wasp asked he asked about 3 times for permission to request, from Fletcher, excuse me, I had another brain fart there, for the air group to be able to attack them as they were thinking that they could do so. But he was refused each time. According to Admiral Fletcher, he did not see a battle report until about 6 a.m., and some of his staff implored him to turn back, but he had refused. Admiral Turner observed the gunfiring that was going on about 1:45 a.m., so he had to stop unloading. I mean, he had no choice since he had lost his air cover, and it seemed like a lot of their surface ships were being knocked out. He basically had to leave. Without any word from General Vandergrift on the state of the unloading process, Turner faced, this crucial decision. He was very well aware that the cargo was far from unloaded. He knew that the surface action occurred and that there was an absence of attacks on the cargo ships for now. So he decided to stay another day to unload, showing some brass balls that Fletcher didn't have, mind you, because Fletcher just ran away. They had no air cover. He informed Fletcher of his decision at 6:41 a.m., and he added a plea to Fletcher for some air support from the carriers. Fletcher never even stopped for a moment, apparently, and Turner would receive his answer about 2:15 p.m. when he intercepted a message from Fletcher to Gormley that Fletcher abdicated his role of the Expeditionary Force command to Turner.
Yeah, way to go to try to shed the blame, Fletcher. I mean, on this, I'm gonna say that because in that much time, the carriers would have put at least 150 kilometers of distance or so between them and where Henderson Field would be, and yeah, now the aircraft can't do anything.
Yeah. So during that morning, Turner gradually became aware of the real situation. Canberra and Astoria were sunk. No one could find the Jarvis, and then he had to halt unloading at about 8:40 a.m. because a report was coming in that Japanese bombers were heading south, and there was nothing that could stop them. Admiral Yamada, commanding the 25th Air Flotilla, he anticipated contact with American carriers at this point, so he mounted a strike at 7:40 a.m., and this consisted of 16 Bettys and 15 Zeros. Instead of aiming to strike at the transports, he chose to hunt the Jarvis. That was about 103 miles southwest of Savo. So in the last fight, Jarvis clawed down about 2 Japanese planes and damaged another 4 before she was sunk. On August the 9th, as the day faded, Turner gathered his depleted task force, and by sunset, he withdrew from Naval. And the Marines were left alone on Guadalcanal. In many ways, it was a spectacular victory for Admiral Mikawa. But it was a very flawed victory because he had the chance of pretty much destroying all of the transports. They were completely left vulnerable, but he had pulled out. And that's basically the Battle of Savo Island.
It's I think it's more crucial in the terms of the missed opportunity because not only Mikawa failed to, hit it, but even Admiral Yamada's air flotilla could have gone for the transports, and that would have actually been a crippling blow. But they decide to attack, just because of the doctrine, it's a military target is a juicier target in their eyes.
If they had gone for the transports, without those resources, the chances of the Marines surviving Guadalcanal extremely diminished.
Yeah, especially if we consider even with the Kawaguchi detachment that would come, because that is the first sizable reinforcement army. I mean, I think Major General Kawaguchi might have been able to pull it off because of the lack of supplies for the Marines.
Well, it would have completely changed the situation because the Americans would be potentially they would be mounting a rescue operation at that point because if
Pretty
they're
much.
if they're unable to get supplies to the island, they would have to pull them off. So yeah, no, it really it's one of those pivotal moments where Guadalcanal could have been won if Mikawa had just gone through and tried to do a second attack. Mind you, of course, we're saying this with hindsight. For all that Mikawa knew, like there was American carriers, they should have been present. They should have been capable of knocking out his fleet if they stayed.
True enough.
There's no way he could have known that he would be facing, I guess, a coward admiral, I guess you could say, who was fleeing.
Ouch. That's.
But
I mean, I wouldn't call it. I would just say hesitant
the
with
thing
an
is,
overall. And
he
I think, I would also just say one thing because he knew. I think Fletcher probably knew Gormley's tendencies.
that's true.
That
Yeah.
Gormley would have said, like, if Vandergrift like said, "Hey, can we withdraw?" I think Gormley would have been the first, like, fastest yes.
That's
Just
very
given the
true.
way he ran that area,
Yeah.
it was. But I really find it like shambolic, the way they just did not inform. Fletcher did not inform Turner.
I
Probably,
mean,
I guess that's because
there
they
was so
never
much,
British.
there was so many mistakes made in this engagement. For one thing, if someone had a map, it's a lot easier to see when you have a map of it. The way that the picket line was made didn't have the radar in forward positions so that they would be the radar was not used properly so that they would be the first ones to see incoming forces, which is why Mikawa kind of luckily dodged all this. It is blind luck that he got through the way he did. So the alignment of the ships was stupid, and this is a problem with the commanders. The commanders don't understand how radar works, it seems, and they weren't positioning their ships right. And then on top of that, when the ships get by through the picket and they start, attacking everybody, no one is sending signals out properly to alert all the forces so that they can bear down upon the so-called enemy. A lot of them just like we saw they assume they were friendlies, and you can make this mistake initially, but my God, it's
I think it's more like the communication failure because, especially from the group that gets under attack first.
yeah,
I mean, should have, like, in some way, whether it be flares, radios, whatever, they needed to get a distress out because if, like, say, the other US ships,
yeah,
even just giving them 5 minutes to start getting into combat capabilities, right? Because we know that crews can be drilled into that, and they would have
true,
conducted these crash course drills. Could have then, inflicted more damage on Mikawa himself.
absolutely,
And,
and
I have to comment a bit about the US Naval Board inquiry. I think they just took a scapegoat, one guy, and, a
yes,
lot of the
yeah.
key decision makers never got the brunt that they deserve.
Definitely. And this was another instance where they should have seen the Japanese capabilities at the forefront and understood the devastating nature of something like the long lance torpedo, but they don't learn from this engagement per se. And there's very, very similar engagements, again, even by Mikawa, that are repeated. And the Americans, they keep falling for the same kind of trick, and I guess you could say. And yeah, well, eventually they'll learn, and eventually their radar is going to overwhelm the Japanese, and it's actually going to be the Americans who are going to be using torpedoes effectively against them. Much more
Yeah.
effective radar. But yeah,
Yeah, it's just kind of sad, with I will just say the Board of Inquiry because they just blame Captain Board of the Chicago for failing to do broadcast, and they wanted to give him, like, just short of a discharge, the highest punishment, basically.
yeah, pretty
Like, a
much.
censure.
Yeah,
And but like Turner, Fletcher, Crutchley, McCain, Captain Reef Cole, who also do deserve a fair share of criticism for the fiasco.
no one did a great job on the American. Yeah, it was pretty bad
Yeah.
all around.
Yeah, no, see, I'm not, it was bad all around, but only one guy got the blame, that is just, unfortunately, he did commit suicide because of that.
Yes, I forgot about
And
that story. That's true. Yeah, it was horrible. He killed himself for it. Yeah.
yeah, because he realized that they are going to only blame him. And I guess it's, just even like Captain Reef Cole, he also never commanded ships again. So I guess that's
Jeez.
some sort of punishment. But
Yeah.
for Admiral Turner, Fletcher, McCain, it's pretty much nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, Fletcher goes out of combat not due to this really, but it's also due to the fact that he lost favor with Nimitz and King.
Very true.
So, but whereas like we know, like Turner becomes pretty much a very experienced commander in amphibious operation landings.
Yeah.
I think almost every major action we would see for the rest of the war would have him commanding, like, the landing forces, like, the landing
Yeah,
operation.
he has the lion's share of it for sure.
Yeah.
And
And it's kind of crazy. I think Crutchley, uh, in he was also given like a Legion of Merit award also from the US.
yeah. Oh
It's
my god.
just, I mean, I'm like, why? I mean, like, but I guess, it's just not gonna look good or whatever, because anyways, this would be like a battle, like a campaign, right? Guadalcanal, where in effect, four admirals are kind of knocked out of the fighting roles.
And
Because
I was gonna say, speaking of Guadalcanal, the next time we do another episode, I think we might hit the naval battle of Guadalcanal. I think that's a good one to cover after this one.
yeah, it would be a good one. I think that was, I guess, the tipping point, for a lack of a better term, in terms of momentum.
Definitely was.
So yeah, and
Well,
yeah,
I think
but it was, yeah, that was like one of the battles where I said like two of the admirals are out.
yeah. I'm gonna go and say this was a long one for the audience. Was a lot of fun covering this. And again, I just want to tell the audience, if you would like to help me out, you don't have to just check out the Patreon account, but it does. You can check out www.patreon.com/specific war channel. If you want, there's almost, I think, 20 plus exclusive podcasts over there. You get to vote on subjects and you get to see all of my content early. But in all honesty, if you really want to just help me out, you don't want to go that route, please just go over to my YouTube channel and just like, subscribe, and leave comments about things you want to hear more about there, because I put all of these podcasts over on the YouTube eventually in a video format. Sometimes I do animation too. It depends on the podcast itself. And I'd really like to grow the podcast on YouTube, because it only helps extend it to another audience. So please, if you can, check it out over there. And Gaurav, I want to thank you again for co-hosting this one. It's a lot of
My
fun.
pleasure. It
And
was.
I think the next podcast we're going to see is going to be a continuation of the North Africa campaign. But as we were discussing, we're going to try and do one by one, a Pacific, do North Africa, Pacific, because there's a lot of episodes for the North
We
African
got it.
campaign.
Yeah, I think we both also reached a bit of a saturation that
Yeah,
need a little break in momentum for this change in
exactly.
routine.
Well, until then, this has been the Pacific War Channel. Over and out.